So welcome back to this session on qualitative analysis. We're going to move on and focus on framework analysis now. Let me give you a little bit of the background to framework analysis. It was developed during the 1980s at the National Centre for Social Research. It was developed specifically for applied or policy relevant qualitative research in which the objectives of the investigation are typically set in advance and shaped by the information requirements of the funding body. It's a matrix-based analytic method. It's rigorous and transparent in its data management. Sometimes it can feel quite enticing for those who come from a more quantitative background because of this matrix-based approach, but I would sound a note of caution that a lot of the skills, a lot of the knowledge and the understanding of qualitative still very much applies to framework analysis. So in terms of an overview, the reason it gets its name is due to the thematic framework which is used to classify and organise data into themes, concepts and emergent categories. Each study has a distinct thematic framework which will comprise a series of main themes and subdivided by a succession of related subtopics. There are 5 key stages of analysis using the framework approach, and these are familiarisation. The second step is identifying the thematic framework. The third is indexing, then you move on to charting, followed by mapping and interpretation. So starting with the first stage, I don't want to rehearse what I've already said in relation to familiarisation because this is very, very similar, almost identical really to what I said in relation to this with thematic analysis. As I say, framework sits in this family of thematics, so there are a lot of similarities here. And this is very much one of these. So just to recap, you'll listen to your audio recordings, you'll read through your transcripts. If you've made notes, read back over them. You'll make additional notes, start to jot down ideas and any recurrent themes that you think might be there even at this early stage. You can refine as you go along, but for just now you can start to take some notes. So very similar. So I'm going to move on because it's very similar. So 2, identifying the thematic framework. So all of the key issues, the concepts, the themes by which your data can be examined and referenced. Now, it might be that you have a set of a priori issues, so those which you've determined in advance, and you look through your data to see what's there in relation to those. So the framework can handle both a deductive and an inductive approach. So deductive is where things are set in advance and then you go look for the data. Inductive is you allow the data just to speak for itself and the codes will develop from there. You should also take note of your study aims and objectives, questions that arise out of those, perhaps looking through your data to see which parts of it can answer those questions. Issues raised by the respondents themselves, views and experiences that recur in the data, for example. It might be that by the end of this stage you've got a very detailed index of your data which labels it into manageable chunks for subsequent retrieval and exploration. So I will show you later some examples of this because it can be a bit tricky if you're very new to this to really get a handle on what exactly is a thematic framework. So don't worry, I will show you an example. Now, you might want to use numbers. Sometimes instead of words, people opt to use numbers, but of course keep a record of what you mean by these numbers. So here is an example drawn from the Ritchie and Lewis book on framework analysis. This is an example they've given from, it's their conceptual framework an index from a study of homelessness among lesbian and gay youth. So this is just one page. There are more substantive categories than this, but it's just to give you an example. They actually had 44 sub-themes in their conceptual framework, but they had 6 main substantive headings. You don't want too many of these substantive headings. You want to be able to hold that structure in your head. So if you're, some people might have 200 codes, you cannot hold that in your head. You can hold these main ones. You might not remember all 44, but you can certainly remember 6. They've also used other, and I'm assuming they used it very wisely and not just thrown a lot of stuff into these categories. Now, indexing, the next stage is where you take that thematic framework and you index systematically all your data. So all your data are now being annotated with these numerical codes or words stroke phrases. Make sure you've got some descriptors, as I say, so you keep track of what all of this means. Now, a single passage of text might encompass a large number of different themes. Each will be recorded either in the margin, if you're printing off your transcripts, as I've said before, in relation to thematic analysis, or you can do this within the software in Vivo. So you go through all of your data and apply this thematic framework to all of your data. Here we go back to the example. It's drawn from the same study and it's from the same book. The authors have used the numerical format of coding, and that can be a really quick way of seeing where they overlap. So in this example, the code 4.2 and the code 2.1, which is written in the margin next to the transcribed text, they sit alongside each other, and this happens on a couple of occasions. Indeed, it might happen throughout large chunks of the transcript, but certainly it's happening here. So it seems that whenever someone talks about one thing, they sort of start to go into talking about another thing. So there's a coexistence here of what's this is about. So once you have developed that framework, you have then indexed, so you've applied it to all of your data. You now want to start charting. So this is where you're sorting and synthesizing your data. So as the authors themselves say, it's a process which is about summarizing key points of each piece of the data. You want to try to keep the context and the language in which it's expressed. You don't want to get too far away from your data. Often we'll place this into a thematic matrix, and this is where something like Excel or some form of a spreadsheet becomes very useful. So again, taken from this book, this is an example of a thematic chart, still drawn from the same study about housing in lesbian and gay youth. It shows a chart in the sense of each column is a particular code. In the example here, it's codes 3.1, 3.2, and so on. And so that's in each column, and each row is your individual interviewee. So when you look across a row, if you're doing this, for example, in Excel, you'll be able to see what did that interviewee say in relation to each of these particular codes or categories. You'll want to try to summarize in a way that still stays close to the data. If they use a particular turn of phrase, you can put that in quotations because it's their word, you're quoting them. So you don't, 2 months later forget that it's not your word, it's theirs, and so on. Sometimes people opt to note a page number if they've maybe got page numbers in their transcripts and say Word documents, so they can go back and find it. This is an example from a study, and I'll put the reference in the list at the end. The first author is Gale, G-A-L-E. And this shows that same thing, down each column is a code or a category, and each row is a particular person that was there. When you chart, for example, using Excel, you might find that you don't fill every single cell. That might tell you something. Perhaps what you were asking was not relevant to that particular interviewee. They were not able to speak to a particular experience, but other participants were. But it might be because you didn't probe within that particular interview. You didn't ask the question. I gave an example in relation to thematic analysis where I said, you know, I've experienced interviews having to be cut short for a variety of reasons, so you didn't get through all of your questions. Take a note of why that might be, why you don't have any data to kind of fill a cell, as that will be important when it comes to your write-up. Clear documentation at this stage helps to keep a record of how you've arrived at the ideas that you do, and which parts of your data set or your evidence are being used here. This can be quite a time consuming stage. It's really not quick to do at all if you want to do it well indeed. So please keep that in mind. Qualitative analysis does take time, and within framework analysis this particular stage does take time, but it is very important, as I have here in this slide, to get a very full and clear picture. Whenever I've used framework in projects and I've developed this chart, I will go back to it time and time and time again. It's something you will use repeatedly to do it well. For mapping and interpretation, you might want to either describe or you want to explain. So if you are opting to describe something, a particular phenomenon from the point of view of your participants, you unpack that content, that nature of that theme, you look for the substantive content, you categorize, you classify. If you want to offer explanation, you look for patterns, you look for links, you look for connections between two different phenomena. Experiences and decisions, for example. There's a kind of natural relationship that seems to be there, perhaps, in your data. Now keep in mind, you can only really say that two phenomena coexist, not necessarily that one explains the other. So be careful about that when thinking about analysis that seeks to explain. You have to be careful in what we're really meaning here when we say explain. And often it's just, there seems to be a pattern here, there's a link or a connection. So if you want to engage in some descriptive analysis, that initial categorization of your data should be actually quite easily recognizable to your participants were you to ever show them any of this. If you draw upon existing theory or other empirical work, you might be able to pull the meaning of these descriptive categories, or you might do that and go too far away from your data, so be very careful. As your analysis progresses, you might find you want to become more abstract and more theoretical, and there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but you must always keep them as close to the data as possible. You cannot say your study found something if you can't back it up with your data, so you've always got to stay as close as you can to your data in that respect, even when you do get increasingly kind of abstract with your findings and how you want to present them. Consider the level of detail at which responses are being captured in your data, and do be as comprehensive as possible with your categorization. It's not necessarily about how often something is happening, but the content that really matters in that descriptive mapping. For explanatory accounts, as I say, you're looking at those connections. So 2 different sets of attitudes, 2 different phenomena sitting quite close together, experiences and decisions. You might find multiple associations, right? For example, beliefs, attitudes, behaviours. Explanations are not in your data in the same way as themes are not in your data just waiting to be discovered. You as the analyst have agency and you're active in what you do and manipulate the data. You are creating these explanations, you are building them. So keep a track record of all of the decisions. You know, imagine you were to be audited. Can you evidence how you got from one place to another in terms of that process of analysis? So I want to give you an example from work that I've done using NVivo. It's a little while ago now, so it might be slightly dated looking in terms of the how I show the NVivo. I've been a Mac user for a while, so this was still done on a PC, so it was a while ago. But anyway, it will still hold today. So using the software NVivo, you can create codes and group them into these categories. On the left hand side of this little snapshot of NVivo on the computer, you will have sources, which can be your transcripts, it could be your memos and so on. So you can use the software for a whole variety of various things you will do as part of your analysis. One of the things I like about the software is when I'm in a particular, say, sort of category, I can click in a particular cell, so it will display very similar to how Excel will display columns and rows. But I quite like if I click in a particular cell within the software, I can see which particular code, so in terms of at the top of a column, and I can see which particular participant, so which row. So no matter where I am in it, I will always see which of these is being selected. And whenever I click in something, I'm never far away from the transcript, so I can always go straight to that part of the transcript. So if I want to double check what's happening, then I can go straight back to the transcript. So even as I'm doing the charting stage and using my own words, I can go back and make sure that I'm being fair to what the participant said. So avoiding some pitfalls. Please try to avoid being quantitative. If you interview 10 people and 9 people say a particular thing, you don't say 90%. It's pretty meaningless with 10 people anyway. You could find something completely different if you interviewed 30 people. We tend not to write like that. You will see that. You will read peer-reviewed, qualitative research that is written in that way. Please don't. It is quite time consuming. I mentioned this in relation to charting, but actually it's quite time consuming overall, all of this process. So please plan projects like this as carefully as you can. And if you need to speak to an expert to get some advice, then do that. I would also advise that you're guided by someone who's experienced in framework analysis, someone who is familiar with each of these stages to help steer you through all of these, any questions you might arrive at. Whether you use thematic or whether you use framework, it's good to have someone to turn to who can make sure you do understand what coding is. But in relation to framework, it's good to have someone to explain what the indexing is and what the charting is. Taking a step back, I would say be reflexive, and that is, you know, think about your role within the research. And I think this applies to all qualitative analysis. You are not neutral. You are a part of this research. Are you a member of the same group that your interviewees are? So for example, I, as a sociologist, am not a member of a group if I interview general practitioners or practice nurses, for example. That is not my discipline, it's not my area. I'm not a part of that group. I'm an outsider. I'm an outsider in that I'm an academic researcher. I'm coming in. How has that shaped the interaction? So for example, one of the ways it could shape the interaction is people who know my background might naturally explain a lot of things to me. But one of my colleagues who has a nursing background doing a similar project might find, and in fact I've spoken to one of my colleagues about this, and she said, oh, it was really difficult to get people to explain things because they just assumed I knew. So think about your own identity, your own experiences, and what you're bringing to the analysis. It's good to not do analysis on your own. If you have a supervisor, please encourage them. They should, if they're a responsible supervisor, they should look at your transcripts and assist you at least part of the way in this process. Do you understand what it means in the qualitative world to generalize? So it's analytic generalization, not generalization to the wider population out there who exists. It's not statistical generalization. So think very carefully about all of these ideas and concepts that are both specific to framework but also general to a lot of qualitative research. So if you want to pause to take a note of some of these references, then please do now. So that's quite a lot, and if you have questions, then I look forward to getting them when we do the live workshop, and I will hopefully see you soon. But for just now, thank you very much for engaging in these videos. I hope you found them useful. I know you will have a lot of questions, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. Thanks everyone.